This is Land of Fabula, Acts 25. Felix kept Paul in prison for 2 years, but now he's left office. He was recalled to Rome according to secular history. Porcius Festus is the new governor. Paul's still in prison. Coming up, the Jews in Jerusalem see the change in governorship as an opportunity to accomplish their goal of killing Paul. Verse 1. Festus, therefore, having come into the province, after 3 days went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Then the high priest and the principal men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they begged him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, plotting to kill him on the way. However, Festus answered that Paul should be kept in custody at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to depart shortly. Let them therefore, he said, that are in power among you go down with me, and if there's anything wrong in the man, let them accuse him. Comment in verses 1 to 5, Festus went to Jerusalem on his 3rd day in office to meet with the Jewish leadership. The Jews petitioned Festus to bring Paul to Jerusalem for trial. Festus said, if you're accusing him, I'll set up trial in Caesarea. You can come there. Verse 6. When he had stayed among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and on the next day he sat on the judgment seat and commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing against him many and grievous charges which they could not prove, while he said in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I sinned at all. Comment in verses 6 to 8, the Jews brought many and grievous charges against Paul which they couldn't prove, and Paul countered that he had done nothing. Coming up, since this trial went nowhere and the Jews are still unhappy, Festus is considering moving the trial to Jerusalem after all, like the Jews want. But he's suspicious, so coming up he'll ask Paul what he thinks about it. Verse 9. But Festus, desiring to gain favor with the Jews, answered Paul and said, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and be judged by me there concerning these things? But Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be tried. I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you also know very well. For if I've done wrong and have committed anything worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if none of those things is true that they accuse me of, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, You've appealed to Caesar you shall go. Comment in verse 9, Festus wanted to know if Paul was willing to move the trial to Jerusalem, with the understanding that he, Festus, would still be the judge. But Paul's already determined in the spirit that he must see Rome, Acts 19:21, and he certainly doesn't trust what the Jews want. He knows that to back up those many false charges, they'll have to put forth false witnesses. He called being sent to Jerusalem for trial being given up to them in verse 11. And he knows that 2 years ago when he was arrested that according to his nephew, the Jews were planning on killing him on the way to the Sanhedrin. And he knows that if he doesn't agree to trial in Jerusalem, Festus will tell the Jews to bring their many false witnesses to Caesarea. So there was no choice for Paul. He appealed to Caesar in verse 11, knowing the appeal would take place in Rome. Maybe the Jews will bring their false witnesses that far, and maybe they won't. Caesar might be more willing to release him than Festus, because the Jews can't pressure Caesar as much as they can Festus. Nero was Caesar at this time. It turned out he was severely hostile toward Christians. There was a devastating fire in Rome in 64 AD that lasted a week and destroyed large parts of the city. Nero blamed it on Christians. This marked the beginning of a Christian persecution. But probably none of this has happened yet, and Nero doesn't have that reputation yet. So Festus granted the appeal in verse 12, and Paul remained in prison awaiting transport to Rome. In the meantime, verse 13, Now when some days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. Comment, this is Agrippa II, part of the Herod family. Bernice was his sister, according to secular history. Agrippa ruled an area just east of Galilee. In verse 13 we just read, he visited Festus in Caesarea. In verse 14, As he stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, There's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, asking for a sentence against him. To whom I answered that it's not the custom of the Romans to give up any man to destruction before the accused has met the accusers face to face and has had an opportunity to make his defense concerning the matter laid against him. When therefore they had come together here, I didn't delay, but on the next day sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought. Comment in verses 14 to 17, Agrippa and his sister Bernice visited Festus many days. No doubt since Festus and Agrippa both governed, they talked shop. The case of Paul came up. Festus said the Jews in Jerusalem wanted a judgment against him, so he heard the case. And verse 18, when the accusers stood up, they brought no charges against him of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him about their own religion and about one Jesus, who was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Being perplexed how to inquire concerning these things, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be kept for the decision of the emperor, I commanded him to be kept until I could send him to Caesar. Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. Comment, so far as we know, Festus hasn't met with Paul personally yet, except at trial, but now he says he'll call Paul so Agrippa and Bernice can hear him. Agrippa and Bernice were Jews, being from the Herod family, which might explain why they were interested in the case and why they thought they might be helpful. Verse 23. So on the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp, and they had entered into the place of hearing with the commanding officers and the principal men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa and all men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom all the multitude of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and as he himself appealed to the emperor, I determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write to my lord. Comment, Festus began the meeting by calling Paul in and telling his guests and his officials under him that they were there to hear from Paul so that maybe they could advise him more exactly what he should write to Nero. To all of them he said, still in verse 26, Therefore I brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, that after examination I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable, in sending a prisoner, not to also specify the charges against him. Comment, Festus is having trouble finding a charge because the accusations are, quote, about their own religion, as he said in verse 19. It would be more natural for internal disputes about Judaism to be resolved among the Jews, but Paul didn't agree to that. And on the other side, Festus can't release Paul because to rule Judea, he has to keep those troublesome Jews happy, so it's an awkward situation. Paul will speak to the assembled officials in Acts 26 next.